Richard, we've talked at length about your life and work for the book I'm writing at present, but we haven't touched upon your early experiences. Are there any things you can remember from your boyhood?
Well, it's a very difficult thing about memory, because it's been much discussed in the 20th century about what do you actually remember, or are you remembering that you remembered something. But I think I can think of lots of pictures of mental pictures of my boyhood, and we were talking earlier about the religious background, the Christian background into which I was born, and so I can remember a lot about that, of the prayers, going to bed prayers with one's mother, and then at school one would would have prayers in the morning and the evening, and I went to a boarding school, and so we had went to a cathedral service on Sunday mornings, and there was an evensong very often on a Saturday evening, and they were very moving because although I wasn't familiar with a lot of Christian teaching at the time, the edifices, the buildings were so enormous and impressive and overpowering in a way, Norman cathedrals. But I can remember the teaching, that Jesus' teaching as being very, very simple and direct. But then, of course, Christianity is the thing which culturally resulted from Jesus' teaching, and so the services, Protestant obviously in this case, was something, they're a construct of the Middle Ages and later.
Yes.
And I can remember the sermons, and not understanding very much about them, particularly at the age of 7 or 8. And principally, I can remember the music, beautiful music that you have in cathedrals.
Music is an essential part of your life, isn't it?
Well, yes, I'm a sort of amateur musician myself, and an amateur singer, and so music has always been a thing which is, it's always made the heart of man happy, hasn't it?
Yes,
and
indeed.
It's a beautiful thing which we can perform in our lives.
And would you say you were a child who thought about deeper things in life? Were you a child who was connected to spiritual things at an early age?
Well, I wasn't aware of them as being spiritual things, but I think in a sense that I was quite a lonely child at first, because I wasn't used to these sort of boarding schools.
Yes.
And so you can feel a bit lonely, and so I had plenty of time to be thoughtful and pensive, and I did think, that I've thought ever since about ontology, by which I mean the science of man's being, and what our purpose is, and how should we live, and so on. Or maybe these are later ideas, but I mean I did think about it, and I thought about Christianity, but more than that, I suppose, having been brought up in the country rather than in a city, my outlet at that time was what I later came to understand as nature mysticism. And so my brother and I would spend a lot of time looking at rivers and trees and flowers, and the changing of the seasons, and I think that the books that I read at that time were about animals and birds and things like that.
Yes.
And nature mysticism is not a thing that I'm occupied nowadays with at all, but it's a thing that has always existed in mankind. The beauty of nature, and I suppose the godly powers that are involved in the earth, and the movement of the stars, and the animals, and the rivers flowing.
Yes. So you, at an early age, you didn't have any profound experiences as such. Was this later in life where your path towards a more committed way of living, did this happen in later life, or there is no profound experiences as such to mention, But what changed your route where you became involved in the teachings of Rumi?
Oh well, I mean, there was no significant event until I did come across the works of Rumi, and that came about through a society in West London where they performed the turning ceremony, which resulted from Rumi's arrival in Turkey when he was a refugee fleeing from the Mongols.
How old were you then?
Sort of 1962, 63, so it would have been 19, something like that.
So basically, was it before your marriage or?
Oh, long before marriage, yes.
Yes. So
yes.
your first encounter with Rumi, was that in London or?
In London.
Yes.
Yes.
If I remember correctly, was that in a bookshop you went to when you first saw one of his?
Oh no, that was much later, because yes. I'm talking about first seeing the Mukabele of,
yes.
of the Turners.
Yes.
And that would have been when I was at art school, in something like 1963 or perhaps 64.
Yes. When did you start reading the Masnavi and Rumi's works seriously?
Well, that would have been more like 1968, when I first attended some classes run by a friend of mine called Edmund Kindersley, who was a very great scholar of. He'd been at Cambridge and studied philosophy and Platonism, Neoplatonism, which had an effect on Rumi, I believe. And so I began reading the Masnavi of Rumi 68, 69, 70. That was when I first started reading it.
Would you say there were any changes while you were reading these, or was it many years later you found transformation within your own being taking place?
Well, I mean, it's strange this, because at the time I'd never read anything like that before. I'd never read Persian poetry at all, let alone in translation, and so it was a completely new garden, really, full of delights, and I loved it, and I thought it was terrific fun, the Masnavi.
Yes.
And I'm very grateful to the fact that I thought it was terrific fun, because if I'd found it boring, then I wouldn't have read beyond page 3.
Yes.
But in a way, that is the honey by which Mevlana catches a fly. It's the sweetness of the stories that catches you. And then you find much later on, and a friend of mine, Anne Brunston, said at one of Alan Williams's talks recently that she had read, the first time round she'd read the Masnavi and thought that the stories were important, and later on, lo and behold, she found that it's the bits that are in between which are far more important.
Doesn't that apply to life as well, do you think?
You could say so, but I only understand it in this sense that the stories are like a sort of decoration hanging on a scaffolding, and the real scaffolding is the structure of the Masnavi, which is a teaching tool without any question, and it's the teaching that reveals itself in between the stories, but the teaching is always there behind it.
How does it serve your life, the Masnavi? How do you live by it? Do you enjoy reading the poetry in the same way as you did when you first encountered it, or now it's on a different level? I
think it's on a different level, and I think probably each time you read it, it affects you differently, or sometimes it may not affect you at all. And I've probably read it 4 times altogether in my life, and so I'm not saying that I'm reading it all the time, yes. But I do teach it, and that means that I have to prepare it and use the exegesis or tafsir to explain it, and so it has meant far more to me in recent years because of going into it in depth and teaching it to other people, which places an enormous responsibility on you, because here you have something which is a very important and sacred work, written for the good of mankind, and it is so powerful that one is aware of the fact that it's a responsibility, and it's an important responsibility. So in answer to your question is that it affects me far more now than it ever did at the beginning, because I'm imparting it to other people, and that's the way that it becomes important. It's far more effective than just reading it by yourself.
Yes. On a spiritual level, as I mentioned earlier, what is the real transformation that is taking place? Whereas other people would read it as poetry, what is it about the Masnavi or Rumi's work that you relate to on a spiritual level?
Well, it seems unquestionable that the real value of it is not reading it as poetry, although I believe that the Persians tell me, and I can hear it when they read it, that it is unbelievably beautiful. And I sometimes read little passages of it in my own broken Persian accent, and I can see how fantastic the poetry is, because you've got rhymes and you've got beat and rhymes within rhymes and rhymes within lines and so on. So that much must be very affecting to people who can understand it. But really, actually, the important point is that even in translation, it changes your life, because it's not just something that you read. It's a valdemecum. It's a guide to life. It's a guide to living, and all the best people, and some of the most unexpected ones, treat it as something by which the writer Rumi helps us how to live towards right thinking.
Thank you, Richard.